This lesson will be about Jacob's encounter with Esau, an incident with Dinah, and the deaths of Rachel and Isaac. Starting in chapter 33, the big day comes when Jacob meets up with Esau, who is coming toward him with 400 men. His last effort at appeasement is to divide his people into three groups in a line. The servants first, Leah and her children second, and then Rachel and Joseph last, with Jacob himself then coming to the front of the line to go meet Esau. So notice that Jacob puts his least valued people first in case Esau attacks. We can assume that jealousy continued to grow in Jacob's household because of his obvious favoritism, and we should learn the lesson that the first in line isn't necessarily the most important, but the most expendable. Over on the right side here, you can see we have net notes, constable notes. My notes, I don't have any, but constable's notes I've never seen, bothered to look at this before, but I think they're pretty good. And you can go look for those online. You can find the link in the description to go to that. The only problem I have with it in this app, this online web page, is it doesn't always line up, and it won't scroll any farther until you go farther over here, and it doesn't always match up. So if you want to look at those, maybe open that up in another window. But it has a great statement about faith here in this section. Many Christians today think that faith is practically a means of controlling God and putting him under obligation to us, and if we don't get what we want, it's because we lack enough faith. This leads to blaming the victim when it comes to healing or deliverance, especially, and all the word faith and prosperity gospel teachers would push this sort of thing that they call faith. But rather than that, which is really presumption, as the notes, Constable's notes points out, faith is trust in God to do what we can't do after we've done what we were responsible for doing. So let's get back to the text then, and Jacob stops. Whoops, I went up a little too far. Sorry about that. He stops 7 times to bow low to the ground before Esau. And, of course, he doesn't know what's going to happen, but he's trying everything. But, to everyone's great surprise, Esau gives Jacob a big hug, and they both cry, which is, talk about an anticlimax to a story. It's not what anyone expected. But then maybe all that preparation actually worked, or maybe this was God's doing. At any rate, nothing bad happened. At least not yet. So after this big meet and greet, Esau returns home to Mount Seir, or however you pronounce that. But Jacob moves at a slower pace due to all the young people and animals that can't travel very fast. But he goes to a different place called Succoth. And note 34, if I can scroll down to where I should be anyway, and click on that, explains that God wants Jacob to go to his family homeland, and he still doesn't know if Esau has genuinely forgiven him yet, or is just luring him to let down his guard. So eventually he arrives in Canaan and camps near a city called Shechem, which will figure prominently in later parts of the Old Testament, but this is where we're going to have that problem involving Dinah. So remember that the daughter of Leah, named Dinah, was mentioned in an earlier lesson, and she decides to try and make friends with the local women. Since they camped there, she went to the town to see who she could meet, but there was a Hivite man that had the same name as the city for some reason. I guess he was a high-ranking prince or something like that. He just grabs her and rapes her. So then he decides he's in love with her and wants to marry her, and only then does he decide that things should be done properly according to custom. This is a good case of selective morality, so that's nothing new. But when Jacob finds out about it, he waits until his sons come in from tending the livestock to decide what to do, if anything. He really doesn't show much concern. So the constable notes that I just mentioned before points out the contrast between Jacob's passive non-reaction to Dinah's rape with his later bitter lament over what he believes to be his later son Joseph's death. So if actions speak louder than words, then inaction shouts, because he should have acted, but he didn't even show any emotion. Far too many Christians in positions of influence today show no concern for sins or heresies committed by either their followers or their associates. They turn a blind eye. And they shouldn't think that just because God delays his judgment that it will never come, or that he approves of them and their ministries. This is a big deal that we should have learned, and we've been seeing all these times that people don't learn their lessons here in the Old Testament, but people today don't learn them either, and we have all these thousands of years of hindsight. So who will be worse off at the judgment than people with the most perspective and people who have the whole scripture to have studied for a long time, and especially in this internet age when there's no excuses for not knowing the Bible, especially on the part of those who claim to be Christian leaders or have a lot of influence. They shouldn't think that just because they're prospering that God approves of their ministry, especially when they turn a blind eye to sins of either commission or omission, which is, acting wrongly or failing to act rightly, that are done under their noses. So Jacob and his sons finally get the sons come in from the field, and they're all together when Shechem and his father arrive to try and offer a large sum of money to appease them and still keep Dinah. But Jacob's sons follow in their father's footsteps by making up a false pretense for making a deal with them, to not only for him to marry Dinah, but also for all their two groups of people to continue intermarrying. And so they decide that all the men of their city would have to be circumcised as if they had this law, and only then could the two groups intermarry. So down in verse 24, we see that what the true intentions were of Jacob's sons, his older two, and that was that all of the men of Shechem were in pain and unable to defend themselves when Dinah's brothers basically went there and slaughtered them all. But neither the brothers nor Shechem had considered the consequences of either of their actions. In verse 30, let me scroll down there, Jacob tells them that not only have they made his people a stench to the locals for breaking an agreement made in good faith, that was huge mistake number one in reaction to huge mistake number 0, I guess, on Shechem's part. They have also just motivated the much larger forces of the area to attack them. Even so, the brothers justify their actions in defending the honor of their sister. At least the brothers showed some kind of indignation on behalf of their sister, but they should not have used such deception, and they should have at least warned everyone else so they'd have time to get to safety or muster an army. They didn't think that far ahead, or any far ahead at all. The great irony here is that Jacob's main objection was to this deception when they likely learned it from his examples. He didn't care so much, Jacob didn't care so much what Shechem had done to his daughter. He mostly cared that his sons made an agreement that they intended to break. And as the constable notes point out on that section, this is the likely reason that Jacob will eventually skip over these two of his sons when giving his final blessing, which will go to Judah, the tribe from which David and then Jesus will come. So time and again we see how God works through and around his chosen people to keep his promises in spite of what they do to thwart those promises. So it's more, God's blessings come often more because of his promises and less because of anything the people do to merit those. And this holds true for us today as Christians. We should never take God's blessings and mercies as tacit approval of our choices. Going back again to that thing about, ministries today thinking that they're prosperous because God is approving of them, when in fact they may just be heaping up judgment to themselves. So now God has to step into this mess, and he tells Jacob to go immediately to Bethel. Curiously, many of his entourage still had been holding on to their idols, but now they have to give them up. So Jacob is finally showing a little bit of spiritual backbone here. And as they travel, other towns along the way leave them alone because they know, at least have some reason to fear God, whether it was because of how treacherously the sons had dealt with Shechem or something supernatural. Who knows? It just says that they left them alone. Eventually, they get to a place where Jacob had that vision of the stairway that reached to the sky. And that is where Deborah, Rebecca's nurse, dies, and they bury her there. And then down to verse 10, we see God reinforcing Jacob's name change to Israel and his promise to Abraham and Isaac, which again has to do with physical land and genetic descendants. And then down in verse 16, Rachel goes into labor. She evidently was pregnant. I don't think that was mentioned before, but she goes into labor before they reach what would become known as Bethlehem. And she gives birth to another leader of the tribes of Israel, but her labor is very difficult, and with her dying breath, she names her son Ben-Oni, meaning son of my suffering. But Jacob decides to have a more, according to the culture, according to Constable and other notes, what's a positive name for his son, so he calls him Benjamin, meaning son of my suffering, or sorry, son of my right hand. And it's from this point on that Jacob is at least sometimes more often called Israel in the text rather than still Jacob, but that still goes on for a while. And after this is when we begin to see the character of Israel's sons more than just the thing that they pulled with Shechem. Reuben decides it's a great idea to sleep with his father's concubine, Bilhah. I guess that's how you pronounce that name. And I don't think I have that. Whoops, oh, it skipped on me again. I hate it when it does that. I think we were still on chapter 35, so let me go back up there. I don't know why it does that, but here, at least as we're trying to get back there, the 12 sons of Jacob, Reuben and Simon were the two who made that bad faith deal with Shechem. And then we have Levi, that will turn out to be the priestly tribe, and Judah, the tribe from which the Messiah would come. And then the rest of them there, Joseph and Benjamin were Rachel's sons. Benjamin is the one that we just mentioned. And then we have the rest of the tribes listed there. And so then we get, as I was mentioning, the character of Jacob, Israel's sons. Reuben, as I said, decides to sleep with his father's concubine, and per note 44, if I can find where that is in the text here, because this is a genealogy of Esau mostly, and I think, yeah, Esau. So if we go down here to where it has note 44, well, I must have skipped all my notes. Sorry about that. We'll check that later. Let me see if I can just, nope, it won't let me roll down there. Oh well. They will show in that note that what Reuben did was trying to establish leadership over the clan. So it wasn't just him and his urges, it was him trying to take control of the clan. But the text just reports it and says that Jacob knew about it, but again, he does nothing. So this is, I think when they went into this genealogy, I don't know if I wrote down the wrong note number or what, but these are Esau's descendants. And I lost track of the note, but anyway, it's in Constable's notes that says that this was a common way in the Middle East of people taking over control of a clan. That's how they did that. It was a hostile takeover, basically. So what we're seeing so far in all these accounts of multiple wives and concubines is that to the ancients, sex was mostly about power and property, and women, being physically weaker in general and vulnerable due to bearing and weaning of children, had no real choice in the matter and seemed to have just accepted their lot in life. But we must not accept the leap from there to the trite phrase God's natural order, because God can't be blamed for what human society decides is proper. So we remember what Moses wrote at the end of Genesis 2, that a man leaves his parents to join with his wife and they become one flesh. He was only talking about two people, not a man with a harem, and that rather than owning or possessing or controlling his wife, the man joins to her. That is God's natural order. And we've seen plenty of evidence so far why God's way is better though he makes many concessions and helps us through our unwise decisions. So at the end of, I think this is still chapter 35, unless it's, nope, that was chapter 36. No wonder I couldn't find the note I was looking for, which was 40 something. I'll find that in my notes. Hold on a second. 44. That's why I couldn't find that. Yeah, this was, there were two sets of genealogies and I got mixed up. Sorry about that. Again, this is actually the net notes, not constable notes, but you can read their reasoning was that this is was the practice, and this is a hostile takeover on Reuben's part. It's at least an attempt to do so. So then it says that he went back to his father Isaac, who was still alive when Jacob got there, and I think one of the notes explained that some number of years passed, and at the end of the chapter here, when he finally dies, both Jacob and Esau bury him, and this is the time Jacob has been likely dreading, since Esau had said long ago that he would kill him after their father died. So here we are, but instead of dealing with that, they go into Esau's genealogy, which we'll pretty much not bother with too much, although some of these names will come up later in Israel's history. So looking through here, you can check the names and all, but as another anticlimax, Esau, as I said, just moves away, and that's, and takes all his people with him, and the rest of the chapter is a genealogy. But we're not given any of their ages, really, or when the next generation was born, like we were with, some of the genealogies we've gone over before. But two of the names in that list, the Edomites and the Amalekites, will appear again, especially prominently in the recorded history of Israel as they struggle with the nations around them when they finally settle in the land. And also, when Esau leaves and takes all his people and stuff with him, that leaves Jacob there in the homeland, and so he does in fact inherit his father's estate. So that's pretty much, I think we're going to stop at the end of that chapter, because chapter 37 will begin the detailed account of Jacob's son Joseph, whose life will turn out to be an amazing type and shadow of the coming Messiah. Though Judah, son of Leah, will inherit the promise, Joseph, son of Rachel, will foreshadow the ultimate salvation of his people, and of course, by extension, to everyone else. So again, referencing constable notes on this section, if you go to look at that, Joseph will eventually get a double portion of his father's inheritance, but it will be Joseph's sons Ephraim and Manasseh who become tribal heads of Israel, and that would complete out the total of 12. So, people often don't, when they're reading these passages, don't notice the fact that Joseph is not ever the name of a tribe in Israel. It's his two sons. But then it kind of matches up with him getting a double portion of the estate, even though he's the second youngest of the brothers, so, and that of course will set up more drama and more jealousy in his life. But the rest of Genesis, which has 50 chapters, will be about Joseph and all the things that go with that. So we'll go ahead and stop there and look forward to that in the next lesson.